Imagine this: a gate. Not a simple wooden gate that creaks on its hinges in your house, but something majestic and incomprehensible. A gate through which not just people pass, but history itself. A gate where the earthly touches the divine, where time slows down and the past whispers its secrets to the future. This was the gate of the ancient city, whose name still echoes in our dreams and prophecies. Welcome, my dear night travelers. Write in the comments what city you are from and what time it is where you are listening to this story about a city that has become a symbol of human ambition and divine judgment. Today, we will go to the place where, between two rivers, in the cradle of civilization, burnt brick towers once soared to the heavens, where the languages of all the peoples of the earth were spoken, where laws were written that shaped the course of history, where myths were born that live in our collective unconscious to this day. We're going to Babylon. Close your eyes and imagine the vast expanse of Mesopotamia. The sun slowly sets over the horizon, coloring the sky in shades of pink and gold. The air is filled with the scent of river silt and the dust of antiquity. Somewhere in the distance, the water splashes. It is the Euphrates, the great river whose waters have seen the birth and death of empires, whose voice has been heard by kings and slaves, priests and traders. And now, on the banks of this river, on the Arahtu Canal, which was its branch, rises the silhouette of a city whose name in Akkadian sounded like Babalim, Gate of God. God's Gate. How strange and beautiful these words sound in the silence of the night. What images do they conjure up in your imagination? Maybe you see massive doors made of cedar and gold, decorated with scenes from myths. Or maybe you see something more subtle and elusive, a space where mortals could touch eternity, where prayers were transformed into architecture and architecture into prayers. Interestingly, the ancient Greeks, hearing this name from the mouths of traders and diplomats, transformed it into the familiar Babylon. And the ancient Jews pronounced this name as Babel, the very name that forever linked this city to the story of the mixing of languages. But let's not jump to conclusions. So far, we are just approaching the gates of this marvelous city, and we have a long journey through the corridors of time ahead of us. In Sumerian texts, written in cuneiform on clay tablets, the city was called Kadingira, and again, the same Gate of the God. It was as if the very earth, the very river, the very air of this place were imbued with a sense of proximity to the divine. It is not by chance that one of the greatest cities of antiquity emerged here, in this place where trade routes converged and cultures intertwined. Try to feel this moment in history when time flowed differently, slower, more measured. The 3rd millennium BC. The sun rises and sets over the flat roofs of small houses made of river mud and thatch. The smoke from the hearths where bread is baked, the smell of freshly caught fish, and the sweet aroma of dates hang in the air. Babylon was still a modest settlement, one of many in the Akkadian region. But even then, it had a special energy, a special purpose. Imagine these first inhabitants. They wake up at dawn, when the air is still cool and full of moisture from the river. Men go to the fields or to the pottery. Women go to the river to fetch water, carrying clay jars on their heads. Children play by the shore, molding animals and gods out of the mud. And all of them do not yet know that their small town will one day become the center of the world, the place where decisions will be made that will determine the fate of nations. But time flows like the waters of the Euphrates, inexorably and powerfully. Centuries pass, and at the beginning of the 19th century BC, something changes in the measured life of Babylon. From the north, from the Syrian steppes, come new people. The Amorites, nomads whose ancestors have followed their herds for centuries under the endless desert sky. They speak a Semitic language, worship gods whose names sound unfamiliar to the locals. And they have something that sedentary people sometimes lack: the hunger for change, the energy of movement, the desire to create something new. The Yarurum tribe, one of the Amorian tribes, chooses Babylon as their new capital. Perhaps their leader stood on the banks of the Aratu Canal on one of those quiet evenings when the sun turns into a fiery disk above the horizon, and realized that this was the place of their destiny. Here, at this point, where the waterways meet, where trade and agriculture can be controlled, where the land itself seems to ask that something great be built upon it. The first of the Amorite kings of Babylon was named Sumoabum. Close your eyes and try to imagine this man. He may not have been as tall as many Semites, with dark hair and shrewd eyes. His hands might still remember the touch of a sword and the reins of a horse, but they were getting used to the grip of the ruler of a settled city. He realized that to hold power in this strategically important place, it was necessary not only to fight, but also to build. And Sumoabum began to build. You can almost hear the sounds of the time, the clanging of the masons' hammers, the creaking of the carts carrying bricks, the voices of the workers raising the walls higher and higher. A defense wall was growing around the city, And in its heart, new temples dedicated to the gods were being built. These temples were not like the churches or mosques we are used to. They were massive structures of brick, with narrow windows and flat roofs, from which the priests watched the movement of the stars and planets, reading the will of the gods in them. Sumuabum paid special attention to the temple, which was already called Esagila, the house that raises its head. This temple was dedicated to Marduk, a god who at that time was not yet the chief of the pantheon, but who was already beginning his ascent to the top of the divine hierarchy. Marduk was the patron god of Babylon, and his fate was inextricably linked to that of the city. Sumuabum's successors continued his work. Each new ruler added something different to the architectural appearance of the city. A new wing of the palace, an additional tower in the wall, another temple. Babylon grew unhurriedly, like a tree that grows deeper and higher. With each generation, the city grew stronger, richer, more influential. And now comes the time when the king, whose name will forever remain in the history of mankind, ascends the throne. Hammurabi. Say that name mentally. Feel how it sounds. Hammurabi. In this name, you can hear something majestic and human at the same time. This king ruled Babylon from 1793 to 1750 BC. And it was under him that the first real prosperity of the city came. Hammurabi was not just conquering cities and regions. He was creating an empire. Under his rule, Sumer, with its ancient traditions, and the cities of northern Mesopotamia, with their trade links, were united. The Babylonian kingdom became a true Middle Eastern power, and the whole world learnt the name of the city on the Euphrates. But the most amazing thing happened not on the battlefields, but in quiet scribes' rooms, where scribes scratched out cuneiform signs on clay tablets by the light of oil lamps. Hammurabi was not just creating an empire, he was creating law. His famous code, carved on a black basalt pillar, became one of the oldest sets of laws in the history of mankind. Imagine this pillar, a black stone polished to a mirror-like luster, on which 282 laws are inscribed in gold cuneiform. At the top of the pillar is a relief depicting Hammurabi himself receiving the code of laws from Shamash, the god of the sun and justice. The king stands in a respectful pose, and the god holds out to him a rod and a ring, symbols of power and justice. These laws spoke of many things. How houses should be built so that they would not collapse on their occupants. How much a doctor should be paid for treatment. How members of different classes should treat each other. That the strong should not oppress the weak, Hammurabi proclaimed. calling himself the King of Justice. Although these laws may seem harsh to us today, they reflected an attempt to create a just society where everyone knew their rights and responsibilities. In those days, Babylonian society was divided into 3 classes. There were the Avalums, full citizens who owned land and property, could hold public office and serve in the army. There were Mushkanums, people who were on state support, who received land from the king for their service. And there were Vardumas, slaves who were considered the property of their masters, but even they had certain rights, such as the right to a family and small property. Babylon grew rapidly under Hammurabi. The population of the city increased. New neighborhoods were built with houses of craftsmen and merchants. The size of the city surpassed even ancient Ur, which had previously been considered one of the largest settlements in Mesopotamia. The streets were filled with the voices of people speaking different languages: Akkadian, Sumerian, Amorian. But gradually, the Akkadian language became the main language of communication, the language of trade and diplomacy. On days when the sun was setting and the shadows were long, the people of Babylon could see trade caravans passing through the streets of the city. Camels laden with fabrics from distant lands, spices, incense, precious metals, slowly wandered along the cobbled streets. The traders lead them to inns where cool river water is poured into large clay amphorae, and the tired travelers are treated to barley beer and flatbread. Lamps were lit in the temples, and the priests began the evening services. The smoke of incense rose to the painted ceilings, where constellations and scenes from myths were depicted. There were prayers in ancient languages, and somewhere in the depths of the temples, in the most sacred rooms, stood statues of the gods, adorned with gold and precious stones. Marduk, the patron of the city, had only just begun his ascent to the top of the pantheon, but his influence was already felt in every stone, in every street of the growing city. But time does not stand still. The dynasty of Hammurabi ruled Babylon for several centuries, and the city continued to grow and develop. But around 1595 BC, an event occurred that changed the course of history. New invaders came from the north, the Kassites, a mountain people from Zagros, who brought with them new traditions and a new way of thinking about government. The Kassite period in Babylon's history lasted almost 600 years, and it was during this time that the city acquired what we call classical appearance. Imagine how slowly, year by year, decade by decade, the architectural appearance of Babylon changed. The chaotic building of the early period gave way to thoughtful planning. Streets now intersected at right angles, creating a regular network that divided the city into rectangular neighborhoods. The main architectural achievement of that time was the construction of the Wall of Imgur Enlil, a powerful rectangular fortification that encircled the entire city. This wall was not just a defensive structure, it was a symbol of power and permanence. Its towers rose at equal distances from each other, like guards protecting the peace of the citizens. Each side of the wall had 2 gates, decorated with reliefs and guarded by divine beings. Another important event for the spiritual life of the city took place during the Kassite period. King Agum II returned to Babylon the statue of Marduk, which had been captured by the Hittites during one of their raids. Imagine the procession that accompanied the deity's return to his hometown. Priests in white robes carried the sacred statue through the streets, while the inhabitants ran out of their houses, fell on their knees, and smoked incense. The air was filled with the scent of myrrh and frankincense, with the sounds of prayers and cries of joy. Marduk had returned home, which meant that the gods were blessing Babylon again. It was in the Kassite period that the mythology that would make Marduk the supreme god not only of Babylon, but of the whole of southern Mesopotamia, was finally formed. Priest scientists who spent their days and nights in the temple libraries painstakingly reworked ancient Sumerian and Akkadian myths, weaving into them the image of their patron. Marduk became the hero of cosmogonic myths, the victor of primordial chaos, the creator of world order. Kurigalzu I, one of the Kassite kings, made a decision that would change the fate of Babylon dramatically. He moved the capital to a new city, Dur Kurigalzu, the fortress of Kurigalzu. It would seem that this should have led to the decline of the old capital, but Babylon proved to be stronger than political decisions. The city continued to grow, its size far exceeding its former boundaries. Merchants still flocked here, craftsmen opened new workshops, and pilgrims came to worship Marduk in his great temple. During these long, measured centuries of Kassite rule, the soul of Babylon was being formed. The city was learning to be not just an administrative center, but something more, a symbol, an idea, a place where the heavenly unites with the earthly. The ziggurat of Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, rose higher and higher, its steps lost in the clouds. The priests climbed these steps at dawn and dusk to meet the gods and convey to them the prayers of the people. The city walls remembered the dust of the conqueror's march and the peaceful footsteps of the trade caravans. They had seen the sunrises and sunsets of 1,000 days, heard the lullabies that mothers sang to their children, and the battle hymns that warriors sang before their march. In the depths of night, when the city fell into slumber, Only the guards on the towers and the priests in the temples were awake, guarding the peace of those who had entrusted their lives to the defense of the city walls. And Marduk, the great Marduk, was slowly but steadily climbing the ranks of the divine hierarchy. What began as a local cult of a patron god was transformed into something much more significant. Marduk became more than just one of many gods. He became the king of the gods, the creator of the world, the holder of the tables of destiny. The myths about him reflected not only religious ideas, but also Babylon's political ambitions, the desire to become the center not only of the earthly, but also of the heavenly world. Time flows as inexorably as the waters of the Euphrates, and already the Kassite dynasty is slipping into decline. The 11th century BC brings with it changes that envelope the once great power like a fog. Historians call this period the Dark Ages, and for good reason. Imagine the luster of magnificent palaces gradually fading, the clay tablets of sages in libraries becoming dusty, the streets once filled with the voices of traders from all over the world becoming silent. The Babylonian state system, once slender and powerful, is beginning to crack. Dynasties change one after another, like leaves in the autumn wind. The kings, who previously held the threads of control of the vast empire, now more and more often find themselves puppets in the hands of the priestly oligarchy. Temples, which have accumulated great wealth over the centuries, are becoming real states within a state. But in this time of decline, a new force is born. From the north, from the cold mountains of Assyria, comes the rumble of iron chariots. The Assyrian Empire, like a steel fist, clenches around the ancient cities of Mesopotamia. One by one, the old centers of civilization fall, and now the turn comes to Babylon. Assyrian rule was not easy for the Babylonians. The proud city, used to being ruled, now had to bow down to foreign rulers. But the spirit of Babylon could not be broken by mere force. Again and again, the city rebelled against the Assyrian yoke, like a giant who can be bound but cannot be forced to submit. This rebellious character was particularly evident under the Assyrian king Sennacherib. This ruler, whose name became synonymous with cruelty, could not forgive Babylon for its pride and defiance. Rebellion after rebellion followed, and each time the Assyrian armies pacified the city with increasingly harsh methods. And then came that fateful year, 689th BC. Imagine a quiet pre-dawn hour. The city is still asleep, with guards slumbering on the walls and priests reciting morning prayers in the temples. The air is cool and fresh, smelling of river moisture and smoke from the hearths. Suddenly, an ominous, dark streak appears on the horizon. It is the army of Sennacherib. What happened next will forever remain one of the most tragic chapters in the history of the ancient world. Sennacherib didn't just take Babylon. He wiped it off the face of the earth. Total slaughter, selling the inhabitants into slavery, destroying temples and palaces. But that wasn't enough for the Assyrian king. He ordered what was left of the city to be set on fire, and then sent the waters of the Euphrates through its streets to wash away even the memory of the great Babylon that had once stood here. And worst of all, Sennacherib cursed this place for 70 years. 70 years, during which time no human speech was to be heard. No hearths were to smoke. No trees were to grow. The place where once temples and palaces had risen to the heavens was to become a desert, a realm of ghosts and oblivion. But even the worst curses can't last forever. Time heals wounds that seem to be unhealable. After the death of Sennacherib, his son Esarhaddon, a man of a very different character, ascended the Assyrian throne. Perhaps he realized that it was possible to rule not only by the power of fear, but also by the power of mercy. Or perhaps he simply wanted the support of the influential Babylonian nobility, who even in exile retained their influence and wealth. Esarhaddon made a decision that shocked his contemporaries with its boldness. He began to rebuild Babylon. Imagine this moment. The first laborers appear on a deserted plain where the wind drives sand between the fragments of bricks. Architects walk among the ruins with plans in hand. Masons begin to clear the foundations, and somewhere in the distance, you can already hear the creaking of carts carrying new materials. The restoration lasted about 20 years. 20 years of painstaking labor, during which Esarhaddon spared no expense or effort. The best architects of the empire worked on the designs of new buildings. The best craftsmen decorated the walls of palaces and temples. The best materials were brought from all over the Assyrian Empire. The main temple of Esagil and the ziggurat of Etemenanki, the heart of the city's religious life, were especially carefully restored in the year 668 BC. An event occurred that symbolically marked the rebirth of Babylon. Shamash Shum-ukin, son of Esarhaddon, was crowned king of the rebuilt city. The coronation ceremony took place in the newly rebuilt temple of Esagil, in the presence of priests and nobles. Imagine this moment. The young king, dressed in purple robes, stands before the altar of Marduk, and a priest raises a golden diadem above his head. The air is full of the scent of incense. The light of torches plays on the gilded walls of the temple, and it seems as if the gods themselves are present at this ceremony. But Babylon's history is full of unexpected twists and turns. Shamash Shum-ukin, who was supposed to be his father's obedient governor, instead rebelled against Assyrian authority. Perhaps the spirit of the ancient city, the spirit of freedom and independence, was stronger than political calculations. The war was long and bloody. And when Shamash Shum-ukin's brother, Ashurbanipal, finally put down the rebellion, he carried out a massacre in the city that almost surpassed the cruelty of Sennacherib's deeds. But Babylon was like a phoenix. It rose from the ashes again and again. And in the year 626 BC, an event took place that marked the beginning of a new and most colorful era in the city's history. A Chaldean leader named Nabopolassar triumphantly entered Babylon, establishing the 10th Babylonian dynasty and an independent new Babylonian kingdom. The Chaldeans were a people closely related to the Babylonians, but who had long lived on the outskirts of the civilized world. They retained the energy of nomads and the wisdom of sedentary peoples. And when their time came, they were ready not only to conquer, but to create something great. Nabopolassar formed an alliance with Media and the Sumerians, and together these forces delivered the final blow to the Assyrian Empire. In 612 BC, Nineveh, the proud capital of the Assyrians, fell, and Babylon was free again. But the true prosperity of the city began under Nabopolassar's son, a king whose name is known to anyone who has ever opened a Bible. Nebuchadnezzar II. Say that name mentally. Feel its weight, its sound. Nebuchadnezzar ruled from 604 to 561 BC. And it was under him that Babylon reached its greatest prosperity and became the city we remember today. Nebuchadnezzar was not just a conqueror. He was a builder, a visionary, a man who saw architecture as a way to express the greatness of the human spirit. Under him, Babylon began a real building boom. Imagine a city that turns into one big construction site. Everywhere, you can hear the pounding of hammers, the creaking of lifting mechanisms, the voices of craftsmen discussing the details of projects. The air is filled with the dust from the firing of bricks and the aroma of fresh resin used to bond the masonry. Nebuchadnezzar ordered the complete reconstruction of all the main buildings of the city. The ziggurat of Etemenanka, already astonishing to contemporaries by its size, was rebuilt and enlarged. Its 7 steps rose to a height of 91 meters, almost as high as a modern 30-story house. From its summit, one could see the whole of Mesopotamia, endless fields cut by a network of canals, groves of date palms, distant mountains on the horizon. Standing up there, a man could really feel closer to the gods, closer to heaven than to earth. But perhaps Nebuchadnezzar's most amazing creation was the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the world. The king had them built for his favorite wife, Amiatis, a Midian princess who longed for the green hills and cool forests of her homeland amidst the flat plains of Mesopotamia. Imagine these gardens, cascades of greenery rising in terraces above the city walls, where roses and jasmine bloom, where artificial streams gurgle, where the shade of exotic trees provides shelter from the scorching desert sun. It was a real engineering marvel. Water was raised to a height of several tens of meters by means of a complex system of pumps and canals. In the gardens grew not only local plants, but also plants brought from distant lands. Cedars from the Lebanese mountains, vines from Asia Minor, rose bushes from Persia. The air in the gardens was full of the fragrance of flowers and herbs, and the shade from the foliage created cool corners where one could meditate or simply enjoy the peace. However, modern scholars dispute whether these gardens actually existed in Babylon. Strangely enough, there is no mention of them in Babylonian texts of that time, although such a grandiose construction could not have gone unnoticed. All descriptions of the gardens belong to much later Greek and Roman authors. Perhaps these marvelous gardens were in Nineveh and were created by the Assyrian king Sennacherib. But this is not so important for our night journey. What is important is that the very idea of such gardens was born in this region, among these people who knew how to turn a desert into a blooming oasis. During those years, Nebuchadnezzar also rebuilt the famous Ishtar Gate, the northern entrance to Babylon. This gate was dedicated to the goddess of love and war, and its decorations were astonishing to his contemporaries. Imagine the walls covered with glazed bricks of deep blue, the color of the night sky, the color of the bottomless waters of the primordial ocean. On this blue background, gold and yellow reliefs of sacred animals were displayed. Bulls, symbolizing Adad, the god of thunder, and dragon-like Sirushas, the companions of Marduk. Each brick in these reliefs was a work of art. The craftsmen first sculpted animal figures from clay, then covered them with colored glaze and fired them in kilns at high temperatures. The resulting bricks glistened in the sun like jewels, but did not tarnish in the rain and wind. The procession through this gate during religious festivals was like entering not an ordinary city, but a sacred space where every wall spoke of the greatness of the gods. From Ishtar's gate began the road of procession, a wide cobbled street that led to the center of the city. On both sides of the road were walls decorated with reliefs of lions, the sacred animals of Ishtar. These lions seemed to be walking towards the procession, their eyes, inlaid with colored glass, glittered in the light of the torches. During the main festival of the year, the New Year festival in honor of Marduk, a statue of the god was carried along this road, and the whole city was transformed into a single open-air temple. But Nebuchadnezzar went down in history not only as a builder and conqueror. It was under him that an event occurred that changed the destiny of a nation forever and gave rise to one of the most influential religious traditions of mankind. In 586 BC, Babylonian armies laid siege to Jerusalem. Imagine the day when Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, looked down from the fortress walls at Nebuchadnezzar's army camped around the city. The sun was setting behind the hills of Judea, coloring the sky purple, and the fires of the Babylonian camp were flickering in the distance. The tension of impending disaster hung in the air, but there was still hope for a miracle, for deliverance. The miracle did not happen. Jerusalem fell. Solomon's first temple, the pride of the Jewish people, was destroyed, and most of the population was deported to Babylon. This event, which in history has been called the Babylonian captivity, was a turning point in the development of Judaism. Deprived of their temple and homeland, the Jews were forced to rethink their faith. And it was in this rethinking that many of the ideas that formed the basis not only of Judaism, but also of Christianity were born. But for the Babylonians themselves, the deportation of the Jews was only one of many administrative measures of their conquering king. The city continued to grow and prosper. The Jewish artisans and traders who settled in Babylon quickly integrated into city life, bringing their skills and traditions with them. Some of them reached high positions in the administrative system, like the biblical Daniel, who, according to tradition, became an advisor to the king himself. In those days, Babylon was a true cosmopolitan center. Dozens of languages could be heard on its streets: Akkadian and Aramaic, Hebrew and Phoenician, Persian and Midian. Traders from India brought spices and precious stones. Merchants from Asia Minor brought silver and tin. Egyptian traders brought gold and papyrus. The city markets were a kaleidoscope of colors, sounds, and aromas. The center of this multicolored world was the Esagila Temple complex, with its famous Etemenanki Tower. This tower, which the Greeks called the Tower of Babel, rose in steps to the heavens, and each of its steps was painted in a different color: black, white, red, blue, yellow, silver, and gold. At the very top was the sanctuary of Marduk, where only the high priests could enter. At night, when the city fell into slumber, the Tower of Etemenanki continued to live its special life. Astronomer priests climbed to its summit to observe the movement of the stars and planets. They believed that the destiny of the world was written in the celestial luminaries, that the gods spoke to people in the language of the constellations. The records of these observations were kept on clay tablets, and some of them have survived to this day, impressing with their accuracy and detail. Maths and astronomy were not just sciences in Babylon. They were a way of approaching the divine. The priests developed the hexadecimal number system that we still use today to measure time and angles. They compiled the first catalogs of the stars in human history, predicted solar and lunar eclipses, and created the calendar that formed the basis of all subsequent calendar systems. The art of this period reached unprecedented heights. Nebuchadnezzar's palaces were adorned with reliefs and paintings that were not only stunningly beautiful, but also told entire stories. Scenes from myths came to life on the walls. The battle between Marduk and the chaos monster Tiamat, the creation of the world from her body, and the establishment of order in the universe. These images served not only as decoration, but also as a constant reminder of the divine nature of royalty. In those times, literary works that have become classics of world literature were created. The poem Enuma Elish, about the creation of the world, was read during the New Year holidays, when the whole city was transformed into an open-air theater. The Epic of Gilgamesh was rewritten again and again, each generation finding new meanings and shades in it. And the poem about Ishtar's descent into the land of the dead made us think about the mystery of death and rebirth. Imagine an evening in Babylon in Nebuchadnezzar's time. The sun has just set, and the sky is colored purple and pink. Oil lamps are lit in the houses, and their soft light pours from the windows into the streets. Somewhere a musician plays the lyre. Somewhere there are voices discussing the day's business. From the temples come the sounds of evening prayers, and above it all rises the silhouette of the great tower of Etemenanki, on the top of which flickers the fire of Marduk's sacred hearth. Families gather in the homes of wealthy townspeople for dinner. The tables are covered with carpets and filled with earthenware painted with colorful patterns. They serve barley beer drunk through reed straws, flat bread smeared with honey, fried fish from the Euphrates, dates, and figs. The conversation flows leisurely. They discuss news from the market, plans for tomorrow, the latest decrees of the king. At this time, in the royal palace, Nebuchadnezzar is probably sitting in his chambers, looking at plans for new buildings. In front of him are papyrus drawings and models of buildings made of clay. He dreams of a city that will be a wonder of the world, of buildings that will delight posterity. And these dreams come true with incredible speed. It was under Nebuchadnezzar that Babylon became not just a large city, but the true capital of the world. Ambassadors from all the nations known at that time come here, from the Scythians and Greeks, from the Indians and Ethiopians. Dozens of languages are spoken in the palace of the king, and in the chambers of the guests, one can see the clothes and jewelry of all the countries of the world at that time. Copy, publish. But even the greatest empires do not live forever. Time, that inexorable artist, was preparing new twists and turns in the fate of Babylon. From the east, from the Persian mountains, a new force was already rising. The army of Cyrus the Great, the king who dreamed of uniting the entire known world under his rule. 539th year BC. Remember this date, for it was the last in the history of the independent kingdom of Babylon. Imagine the day when Cyrus's army appeared on the outskirts of the city. The Babylonians, looking down from the high towers of their walls, saw the endless rows of Persian soldiers, their colorful banners, the glitter of their weapons in the sun. The city seemed impregnable, a triple ring of walls, deep moats full of water, 8 powerful gates, each of which could withstand a long siege. Herodotus, the great Greek historian, wrote of the walls of Babylon with admiration and wonder. So high and wide were they that a 4-horse chariot could drive on top of them. These walls remembered many things. The inner wall of Imgur Enlil, whose perimeter was more than 8,000 meters, was a true miracle of fortification art. Its thickness reached 5.5 meters, and its height was lost in the clouds. The towers alternated at regular intervals, creating the feeling of an endless stone wall that could protect the city from any enemy. Behind it was a second wall, Nemeth Enlil, thinner but no less formidable. And behind the second wall was the third, surrounded by a deep moat in which crocodiles, specially brought from the Nile, swam. But Cyrus was more than a warrior. He was a strategist, a man who thought outside the box. Instead of a long and bloody siege, he chose a different path. One night, when Babylon was celebrating a religious festival and the attention of the guards was waning, Persian engineers did the incredible. They diverted the waters of the Euphrates. Try to imagine this night. The moon is hidden by clouds, and darkness envelops the city. Hymns in honor of the gods are being sung in the temples, and the streets are full of celebrating citizens. Wine flows, dancers twirl to the sound of harps and drums, and no one notices that the water level in the river, which flows through the city center, begins to slowly drop. Meanwhile, the Persian warriors are already sneaking along the dried-up bed of the Euphrates. The water is only up to their knees, then to their ankles, and then they are walking on the dry, rocky bottom, which is usually hidden under water. The city walls, so strong and impregnable on the land side, were defenseless on the riverside. The Persians entered the city like ghosts, and when the Babylonians realized what had happened, it was too late. But amazingly, Cyrus did not destroy Babylon. On the contrary, he showed the city rare respect and mercy. The Persian king understood the value of what fell into his hands, not just another conquered city, but a real center of civilization, a place where knowledge, arts, and traditions of thousands of years were concentrated. Babylon became one of the capitals of the Persian Empire, retaining its greatness and importance. It was during these years of Persian rule that those Jewish exiles lived in Babylon, who may have witnessed the grandeur of Etemenanka. Dr. Irving Finkel suggests that it was then, looking up at this grand tower rising to the heavens, that the Jewish sages created the story of the Tower of Babel, a parable of human pride and divine judgment. The 11th chapter of the book of Genesis tells how, after the flood, people who spoke the same language decided to build a city and tower up to heaven to make a name for themselves. Imagine this biblical scene: the vast plains of Sennar, where a grand construction site rises among green fields and groves of palm trees. People carry bricks and building materials. Architects show plans, and the tower grows day by day, tier by tier, approaching the clouds. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, says the Bible. And further, and the Lord mixed there the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them over all the earth. This story explained to the ancients the origin of many languages and peoples, but it also hides a deeper meaning, a warning about the limits of human ambition, that there is a line that should not be crossed by mortals. The prophet Isaiah, who lived a century before the fall of Babylon, foretold the fate of the great city in words full of poetic power and prophetic fire. And Babylon, the beauty of kingdoms, the pride of the Chaldeans, will be overthrown by God like Sodom and Gomorrah, he wrote. It shall never be inhabited, and in the generations of generations there shall be no inhabitants in it. No Arabian shall pitch his tent there, nor shall shepherds with their flocks rest there. Modern scholars argue about how accurately these prophecies were fulfilled. Cyrus did conquer Babylon, but he did not destroy it. The city existed for more than 1,000 years, gradually losing its importance, but not disappearing completely. Perhaps these prophecies contained not so much a literal truth as a symbolic one, a prediction that all earthly greatness is transient, that even the mightiest empires will one day become the property of history. Time passed, and gradually, the ancient traditions of Mesopotamia began to give way to new ones. The Akkadian language, spoken by the inhabitants of Babylon for thousands of years, was gradually replaced by Aramaic. Cuneiform, that marvelous writing system created by the Sumerians in the 4th millennium BC, gave way to the simpler and more convenient alphabetic script. Clay tablets were replaced by parchment and papyrus. In the 1st century AD, Christianity came to Mesopotamia, and Babylon became the seat of the Catholicos, of the Church of the East. Imagine this moment in history. In a city where Marduk and Ishtar were once worshipped, Christian hymns are now being sung. In temples where priests recited the Enuma Elish, priests now read the gospel. But this change of religion has been gentle, without sharp ruptures. Many ancient traditions have simply been reinterpreted in the light of the new faith. Antiochus I Soter, one of the Diadocos of Alexander the Great, moved some of the inhabitants of Babylon to the new capital, Seleucia on Tigris. This was the symbolic end of an era. The city, which had been the center of the world for more than 2,000 years, gradually transferred its functions to other settlements. But Babylon was not dying. It was slowly falling asleep, like an old wise man who had lived a long and glorious life and was now preparing to rest. In medieval times, Arab builders used bricks from Babylonian ruins to build Baghdad and Basra. Each of these bricks carried a piece of history, a piece of the energy that once boiled in the capital of the world. New settlements, such as El Hilah, were also built from the stones of the ancient city. Babylon continued to live, but no longer as a city, but as material for new cities, as the basis for new civilizations. In the 19th century AD, systematic archaeological investigations of Babylon began. Claudius James Rich, Robert Kerr Porter, Robert Mignon. These names have forever entered the history of Assyriology. But the true discoverer of Babylon for modern science was the German architect Robert Koldewey, who led the expedition from 1899 to 1917. Koldewey and his team performed a real miracle. They not only excavated, but also reconstructed the famous Ishtar Gate. This gate, covered with blue glaze and decorated with golden reliefs of sacred animals, was carefully dismantled, transported to Germany, and restored in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, where it still stands today, impressing visitors with its beauty. Imagine Koldewey's feelings when the first fragments of this marvelous gate emerged from under the sand and rubble. The blue bricks, with the images of bulls and dragons in gold, looked as if they had been made yesterday, not 2,500 years ago. At that moment, the past became the present. Ancient beauty returned to the world. Modern Babylon is a place where past and present exist side by side. In 2019, the ruins of the ancient city were inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. Thousands of people today live within the ancient city walls, sometimes unaware that under their homes are buried palaces of kings and temples of gods. The modern El Hilla spreads out next to the ruins, and its inhabitants walk every day past the stones that remember the voice of Nebuchadnezzar and the prayers of the Babylonian priests. In the Christian tradition, Babylon became a symbol of a world in opposition to God. In the revelation of John the theologian, it appears as Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. This symbolic use of the name of the ancient city shows what power the images associated with it had in the minds of people. Babylon became not just a place name, but a metaphor, a designation of all that in human civilization that resists the divine will. But there is another reading of the Babylonian story. In Jewish tradition, the time spent in Babylonian captivity was a period of spiritual maturation for the people. It was there, on the banks of the Euphrates, in the shadow of ziggurats and palaces, that the Jewish sages created the foundations of the teachings that later developed into rabbinic Judaism. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept when we remembered Zion, sings the psalmist. But in this lamentation, there is not only bitterness of loss, but also hope for rebirth. In the Islamic tradition, Babylon is mentioned less often. But even there, the memory of the tower that people tried to build to the heavens has been preserved. However, the Quran says that this tower was built in Egypt by order of Pharaoh, but the symbolic meaning remains the same. A warning about pride, which leads to the fall. The winged expression, Babylonian pandemonium, still lives in the Russian language today. When we speak of turmoil, disorder, chaos, we involuntarily recall that biblical moment when the builders of the tower suddenly stopped understanding each other and the work stopped. This expression reflects the complexity and contradiction of the Babylonian heritage, a city that was both a symbol of human greatness and human pride. Today, when you drive past Babel Hill in modern Iraq, all you see are low mounds of low vegetation. It is hard to believe that glazed brick towers once rose to the heavens here, that kings and priests, merchants and artisans walked these streets, that laws were made here that formed the basis of all subsequent jurisprudence. But if you listen to the wind that blows among the ruins, you can hear the echoes of those distant times, the whispering of ancient prayers, the sound of forging hammers, the splashing of water in the canals, the laughter of children playing in the shade of date palms. All of this is still alive here today. You just have to listen. Scientists continue to study Babylon. In 2010, the World Monuments Fund launched a new project to preserve and restore ancient buildings. Modern technology makes it possible to see the city as it was in its heyday. Computer reconstructions recreate majestic walls, luxurious palaces, grandiose temples. And in these reconstructions, Babylon comes alive again, rises again from the ashes of time. But the most amazing thing about the history of Babylon is that it continues to live not only in scientific research and museum expositions, but also in our collective imagination. Images of the Tower of Babel, the Hanging Gardens, and Ishtar's Gate have become part of world culture. Artists depict them on their canvases. Writers use them as metaphors in their works. Film directors recreate them on cinema screens. This, perhaps, is the true immortality of Babylon. The city may be destroyed. The bricks of its walls may be scattered to build new houses. But the idea of the dream city, the city where man tries to touch the divine, lives on through the ages. Every time an architect designs a skyscraper that rises to the clouds, every time a gardener creates a marvelous garden in the desert, every time a legislator writes a just law, the spirit of ancient Babylon lives in these actions. And perhaps there is a special meaning to this. Babylon was not finally destroyed. It was simply scattered around the world, just as the builders of its tower were scattered. Every modern city has a piece of Babylon in it. Every code of law echoes the code of Hammurabi. Every temple or cathedral reflects the aspiration to heaven that was embodied in the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. So ends our night journey through ancient Babylon. We walked with you through its streets, climbed its towers, looked into its temples and palaces. We have seen how empires are born and die, how cities are created and destroyed, how human dreams are realized in stone and brick, and then turned into dreams again. May this story accompany you in your dreams. May you sometimes hear the echo of ancient voices in the noise of modern cities. May you see the reflections of Babylonian towers and tall buildings. After all, we are all heirs of that great civilization that taught mankind to dream the impossible and make the impossible a a reality. Good night, my dear listeners. May the gates of dreams open to you as wide as the gates of Babylon once opened to travelers from all parts of the world. See you in our next night journeys through the labyrinths of history and the human soul.